Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast. Today I'm talking to Joy Marie Clarkson, who is a research associate at King's College London, books and culture editor at Plough Quarterly, and the author most recently of You Are a Tree. Well, thank you for doing this.
It's wonderful to finally speak.
I know we've been acquaintances for a long, long time, and you've been, at the very least, through quite a few life changes. I think when I started following you, you were a PhD student, which now you're no longer. Now you're a certified academic.
Yes, at least I'm trying to be.
How's it going?
I think I've been very fortunate. It's not an easy job, both in the sense of the job market is just atrociously terrible. When people ask about doing a PhD, I give them many reasons not to before they choose to do it. But I have been really fortunate in opportunities I've gotten and also the people I've gotten to work with. I really love working at King's College London, and they have an amazing program in Christianity and the arts that's shared with the National Gallery. So I've gotten to teach students, and the class I taught last year was the idea of beauty in Western theology, which was so much fun. It was a class I inherited. And I was teaching theology students, but also like working artists. And so I feel very lucky to have been able to do that. And the lines have fallen to me in pleasant places so far. But we'll see what the coming years hold.
Can you tell us at all about what you're researching now?
Yes. So my area is theology and literature, ostensibly. And when I set out to do this, it's basically a postdoctoral fellowship, which is, kind of when you finish the PhD, if you're lucky, you can find some funding or find a postdoc where you can kind of have a few years to publish everything you've been marinating on for the entirety of your doctorate. So when I set out to do this, I had kind of two goals. One was to turn what I did for my PhD into a book. So that was actually on spiritual practices that prepare people for death. So how it's kind of based on a movement in the medieval era where basically so many people were dying from the plague that priests couldn't reach them to give last rites and to kind of offer spiritual guidance. So this whole kind of genre of images and music and texts emerged to help people meditate on the death of Christ and prepare for their own death in really practical ways. So I kind of looked at that, and then I looked at the present day and said, we kind of don't have those resources anymore. So how do you see people orient themselves towards death? How are they using things like popular art to help themselves kind of understand what it is to die? And in what ways does that resonate with and depart from the kind of Christian tradition of using art to prepare for death? So that is what that's my I don't know, my white whale, the thing I'm trying to catch or not be conquered by or conquer. But then also a series of articles on disenchantment in modern literature. So I just finished one that's under review about Piranesi by Susanna Clark, and kind of looking at how she draws on Owen Barfield's ideas of disenchantment and what he kind of the way he describes it is participation, original participation and final participation. So I did that and kind of looking at that as a slight cautionary tale about reenchantment. Because on the one hand, we love Piranesi. Have you read Piranesi?
I have not, no.
Okay, we have to read it at some point. It's great. I think you'd really enjoy it. But it's kind of about, it's about whether it's possible to see the world as a place in which there is order and meaning, where God is kind to us, both kind of after the shambles of modernity, but also after trauma. So it's a really interesting book. And then I'm actually just getting ready to leave tomorrow, and then I'll stop rambling about my research, but you did ask me. I'm getting ready to leave tomorrow to present on another of the articles in that series, which is on Clara and the Sun by Kazu Ishiguro.
Okay.
Have you read that one? You should read that one if you haven't.
No.
Also,
I don't read novels.
Well, there you go. You could listen to them, audiobooks. I hear they're
know.
good.
I know that. Just as a side note, I understand. It's not something I'm proud of. I understand it's a character defect, but I cannot get more than 10 pages into any piece of fiction before I think, why am I reading this? So I'm glad that there are people like you to tell me about
Yes.
what I need to know.
No. Well, yeah. So anyway, that one's about also, it's kind of about artificial intelligence and yeah, it's really interesting. Ishiguro is famous for doing these kind of gut-wrenching, uh, disorienting, disenchanting novels. But this one, it has this kind of hopeful um, openness to the possibility of a loving God that's really interesting. So doing that series. So those are kind of my broad areas, but just generally it's theology and the arts and kind of where contemporary culture meets religious concern and openness.
Is it possible to see the world as a place that of order and enchantment where God is good to us after the shambles of modernity?
I should like to think so. I think on my good days I do. One of the things that I think is important to remember is that when you have these kind of narratives of disenchantment, a lot of it comes from, it was kind of popularized, obviously, by Max Weber, who was a sociologist in the turn of the century in 1900s.
What's an example of a narrative of disenchantment? What does that look like?
So part of what I mean by narrative disenchantment is like how we have this idea that basically prior to the scientific revolution, everybody experienced the world. It was kind of a given that God existed, that our lives had meaning, that when we looked to nature, we could kind of interpret some of God's presence in it. And the kind of historical or philosophical story goes that then Francis Bacon came around and he said, knowledge is power. And we started to become alienated from nature. We kind of saw the natural world as something that was just kind of a giant machine that ticked on. And maybe God designed the giant machine, but we didn't really need to think about God in the machine because it did its own thing. And so that's kind of the story. So the story is that all happened. It led us to a point where now the average person has to opt into believing in God rather than opt out of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, I think that story is very compelling, right? We do live in a world where far fewer people are religious, and we live in a place where, as we've kind of talked about before, that this kind of the spiritual world that we live in feels a bit deadening. It feels a bit heavy. But the thing that I think is important and that I've tried to draw out in my research is it is just a way of looking at the world. Like the scientific revolution did not prove that God didn't exist. And even Francis Bacon wasn't setting out to do that. But it's kind of this sense that the habits of thought and the habits of attention or inattention have made it so that we don't notice kind of meaning and patterns and presence that might actually be there in the world, but we've just gotten used to not looking for it. So I think something I like to think about is, what does it mean to try to kind of train our attention so that we see those things that might actually be in the world, but we're just kind of out of the habit of attending to them.
Mm-hmm. So there's a practical part, a part that, when I say practical, I mean lends it to itself to practice.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Does that have anything to do with being a tree?
It does.
What's the connection between what you're talking about and your most recent book?
So my most recent book, which is more, academics make these big distinctions, but it's more out of my research, but more in a kind of lay reader language, and kind of getting to dip into my creative writing self, which I love being able to do. And that is about the metaphors that we use in everyday life. So the title, You Are a Tree, is partially in contrast to what I see as kind of the mechanical and money metaphors we use in everyday life. So we talk about needing to recharge, to switch off, to shut down, to update our friends, to download information. And all of that is kind of describing ourselves as these elaborate machines. And that makes sense that we use those things to describe ourselves because we have machines in front of us all the time. And metaphors are these things that we kind of reach for that are visible and tangible to describe our invisible and tangible feelings. But the problem with that is that it kind of lends itself to that disenchanted view of the world, right? If I think of myself as this machine with cogs and parts, I'm replaceable. My existence is mainly for production and productivity. And I'm kind of I'm unto myself, right? Computers, they need to be charged, but they are these kind of entities that are isolated and by their nature don't need to be in the company of other computers. And so my book was kind of trying to say, well, if these sorts of metaphors have negative impacts on us, then what are other metaphors that we could use that help us kind of speak in ourselves in more humane ways? And to answer that question, I kind of looked to what I thought of as ancient metaphors. So what are metaphors that have stood the test of time? So I looked at people as trees, wisdom as light, safety as kind of stronghold or something that is safe and above, love as a disease. That was an interesting one to write about. Sadness is heaviness and life is a journey. And I know that all sounds very kind of, they can sound kind of, inspirational plaque-ish. But I think what I wanted to really get at with the book was that in paying attention to these everyday aspects of our life, like trees and light and heaviness, we realize that there's so much kind of meaning present in our experiences that we may not be able to notice if we don't slow down and attend to our experiences in the ways we describe them. So that's kind of what I wanted people to take away from the book, was kind of a practice, a spiritual practice of attention, both to how we describe and speak about our experiences, and also to the ways in which kind of there's meaning and presence invested in the natural world.
I'm very interested in the question of what people don't know and what people are not conscious of, and the way that we operate on unconscious assumptions. And even to say unconscious assumptions is a little bit to misspeak, because if we pay attention, we often see that our unconscious assumptions aren't even assumptions, because they're not formed in any kind of sentence. They're a feeling or an image. And I think that part of the reason modern or postmodern, well, contemporary people anyway, are so lost with regard to suffering is that they are operating unconsciously on these assumptions that you're getting at. That if you are a machine, how do you even begin to answer the question of why do you feel so bad? Because machines don't feel bad.
Yeah.
And these metaphors become not just simply something that forms the foundation of how you live, but they become aspirational. That people begin to feel like they should be machines, not simply that they are, but that they should be. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's entirely correct. Even just thinking about, we do sometimes describe people, we say, wow, he's a machine. He's really cranking it out. He's living the grind. That's one of the, but I think that the thing about metaphors is I think they shape your expectations of what is possible. And they are incredibly powerful because they do operate largely at that kind of unconscious level. And I think like other examples of that would also be the way that we describe relationships as kind of monetary or work oriented. So we talk about investing in a relationship and, taking the second shift or sunk cost fallacy. And we know we use all that language because relationships are a thing of value, something that but if your whole kind of sense of relationships is as high value, low value, then it will shape your expectation that you should kind of regard relationships in this kind of competitive bidding war way. And then that, I think, becomes so problematic. So I guess I'm just not very helpfully saying, yes, I think you're right, that metaphors not only shape how we think, but then they can kind of harden into something that, rather than being a way to be able to articulate something about our experience, we begin to start fitting our experiences into the metaphors. And that can cause pain, precisely because, and this is something I talk about in the book, no metaphor is complete. You need many metaphors to understand life, I think.
It strikes me, too, that when we talk about relationships in a mechanistic age, part of the way, and it's interesting, you see this a lot online if you pay any attention to kind of dating discourse or marriage discourse at all. You see so much of a mechanistic view of things there. And the one outcome of that is the total dismissal of a character. So that because if everything is determined by a mechanistic process, the kind of person you are has no real long-term effect on the relationships that you have. And I think that's probably something you're trying to undermine by raising the issue at all.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's funny. I've been thinking about it because I've been reading, sorry to cite another novel. You can watch this one on TV though.
Okay.
I've been reading Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, and really interesting book about why people make the choices they do and to what extent we're conscious or unconscious. So it's reminding me of all these conversations. But one of the characters kind of does that. She makes a relational choice based on, in that era, it's very economic, right? It's, what husband will get her the best, whatever. But it is this example of, if you're thinking of it in kind of a mechanistic or economic way, her choice to marry the person she does works. But it's because she's purposefully kind of blocking out the sense of the character of who he is. And character is not something that can be easily, you can't put a dollar sign on character, right? And so it's excluded from her evaluation. And I think that's often why, if we're thinking about everything mechanistically in our world, we just exclude things that are not easy to evaluate
Do you think that in a situation where you have a culture where all relationships are seen mechanistically, do you think that affects men and women differently? Since you brought up this character who, obviously in that context, she makes the choice she does because she's a woman. If she were a man, she might have other options or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sure it does, for many reasons, partially just kind of the culture we live in. And so the expectations we have for men and women are different, and they probably react to that mechanization in different ways.
I wonder if it's harder for women to think of themselves as machines because they have children, and the process of being pregnant and giving birth is so unmachine-like, right? That they experience their bodies in these very non-machine-like, unpredictable, often difficult ways. And maybe men have, especially young men, have an easier time experiencing themselves as machines because their identities don't have as much to do with
this
biological
kind of mysterious process.
Right.
Yeah. Although I guess on the other hand, you also, the phrase baby making machine is also a, but maybe that's a different that's more of a depersonalized kind of objectification of women as opposed to their own experience of themselves.
Right. I was going to say, yes, it's men who say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. The here's the question. So given all of this, what does a flourishing and good life look like, you think, given the context you've described?
So I think I could answer this in many ways. I think maybe the first thing I would say is that if we kind of take as the assumption that we live in a world that's very shaped by these mechanistic metaphors and by these monetary metaphors where kind of all domains of our life can be measured and bought or sold, then a part of a flourishing life is resisting that kind of all-consuming image of our life. And I think a part of that comes with thinking of other ways to describe our lives, right? So if it's not this kind of buying and selling, producing madness, then what are other ways to think of our lives? So in the book, I talk about a tree, right? That there's this sense that a flourishing life is one of seasons. It's one of rootedness. It's one where not all seasons are producing. Some of them are cold and quiet and deep and frustrating. Some of them are overwhelming with kind of the beginnings of new life. Some of them are overwhelming with harvest. And so I think that's one thing. It's just kind of finding new ways to think about what a productive life is. So I guess when I think about a flourishing life, I do think about a tree. I think about I want to be planted. I want there to be somewhere where I have roots, whether that's physically, geographically, or spiritually. And I think spiritually is the most important. But also that I am intermingling my roots with the roots of other people, that I'm honoring the kind of mystery. You know, a tree, most of what you see in a tree is not, most of the tree is not visible. So most of what we encounter in people is kind of subterranean. So acknowledging that, thinking about sources of nourishment, that we need to have a life that has kind of a healthy ecosystem. You know what I mean? That we're putting ourselves in a place where we're being nourished in many different ways. Trees have birds to pluck their fruit so they don't get heavy, and they need water for their roots, and they need, other trees that are nearby them to send their nourishment through their roots. And then also thinking about really paying attention to the season that we're in and thinking about what kind of nourishment you need in those seasons. So that, I mean, there's many ways to answer that, but that is kind of one of the things I try to think about in the book is how do I cultivate a life that is looking towards fruitfulness?
Do you think, so what you're talking about when you talk about those things is you're talking about how people live at an individual level. And it strikes me that, and you sort of said this, that a lot of the loss that has produced this sort of mechanistic understanding of the self and relationships is a result of the dethroning of Christianity as the cultural meta-narrative. Do you think it's possible for people to live that way without the cultural support for that, or to really live that way, would it require a kind of cultural revolution that would at least be in some way more Christian to support those metaphors and this other way of thinking about the self? Because, when you bring up Francis Bacon, et cetera, you are kind of talking about a transition in the way we think about the self that has happened in the centuries of Christianity's waning power.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think in some ways the seeds of what we have now are from Christianity, like the seeds of the modernity that we live in. They're connected to Christianity. They're not entirely divorced from it. Francis Bacon considered himself to be a very devout Christian. And so I think that's an important thing to think about, is kind of what are some of the ways that Christianity can develop beyond itself, maybe beyond what it means to be sometimes, in ways that can be frustrating or problematic. I mean, I like to generally believe that the world is such that anyone who is trying to pay attention to it, who is trying to have integrity, and who is trying to attune their heart to God's presence could do so, and could begin to do so. And even if we're not in a conducive cultural environment. But it is also the case that we need other people to the kinds of things that human beings are, in the same way the tree actually needs other trees to nourish it. Because they do. That was something I learned while I was doing the book, was how interdependent trees actually are on each other. So I think it is true that we need people to help us, but I think cultural movements do have to start kind of individually as well. Sure. So I'm not answering, it's a bit of both.
Yes, but I think at this point, this kind of way of living out different metaphors has to be an individual project, because we're just not culturally at the point. You can imagine a cultural setting in which the metaphors you're talking about are dominant to the point where everyone accepts them without thinking about them.
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
I think one of the things that kind of is interesting in our time is, like, even though Christianity is waning, I think there is a kind of cultural resistance to the mechanization. So you see, not necessarily always in good ways, but you see, even though there's more kind of nuns, no religions than there ever were before, you see a lot more things that are like spiritual practices now than you ever did 15 years ago.
Sure. Of course.
And in a way, I think that's encouraging, in that it indicates that people are desiring something deeper and are looking for places to do that. Not that just that itself is always necessarily a good thing, because humans always get weird and do weird stuff. But that to me indicates that there is a dissatisfaction with kind of the more mechanization and a desire to move towards it.
The hunger is real.
Yes.
How is love like a disease?
So that chapter was looking at kind of the common metaphors we use to describe love. And one of them is kind of disease or disaster, right? So we talk about falling in love, catching feelings, being lovesick, being crazy in love, all these kinds of sense of either a physical or mental disease. And that goes, deep into poetry, deep into history. It is as a metaphor, love as some kind of disease has a very long history. In the book, I talk a bit about, Plato's Phaedrus, where he talks with Phaedrus about whether or not, or Socrates talks with Phaedrus about whether or not it's better to love or to not love, because when you love, you go crazy and you get in fights with your relatives and you forget to do things for your work. So it's a very kind of time-honored tradition of speaking about love. But what I wanted to talk about in that chapter is that metaphor does shape how we think about love. So if we think about love as essentially something that happens to us, right? That it's something that, like a disease, we catch and we suffer and then it's over. That's not a very sustaining way of thinking about love. And so I looked in that chapter too at thinking, what are other metaphors that we use for love? What are other ways of thinking about nurturing, loving relationships, whether that's romantically or otherwise? And so I thought about kind of the metaphor of a home. We talk about belonging with someone, shutting someone out, letting someone in. And that's one of my favorite metaphors, kind of as something to compare love to, because it has that sense of hope. That love should be a place of safety, that it's something that we kind of can work with the limitations of. Every home is different. Every home has a different personality, different way of being, but you can work with it. So that's kind of two different metaphors of love. Although I will say that I still have an affection for love as a disease. because I do think that's something that is powerful about love, is it is something that overtakes our usual ways of being in the world. So, you know, Socrates ends up concluding that one actually needs to love because it draws us outside of ourselves and towards the forms or towards God. Mm-hmm. So, despite offering other metaphors for love, I still think there's something to be said for love as a divine madness.
That's very interesting. This obviously is an issue that younger adult people deal with, and you mentioned that your book was really kind of aimed toward helping younger adult people think about that stage of life. How? Tell me about that.
It's interesting. I feel like I kind of realized this in retrospect. You know, my other book was Aggressively Happy, which was kind of about why cynicism isn't necessarily actually a deep or admirable position to take in the world.
Let's come back to that. I want to say something about that.
Yes. And that ended just thematically. The last story in that one ended in my flat in St. Andrews. But this book actually started leaving that. And when I think about kind of the period of my life that I wrote both of the books in, you know, the first one was kind of a survival era. It was lockdown. It was finishing a PhD, which is a great tribulation, no matter what you're doing. But this one was more kind of a building and deepening time in my life. And I'm still very young, so I still feel I don't have that much advice to offer. But I think that what I did want for young people to think about is, I get a lot of questions. People get really angsty when they're doing masters, when they're finishing undergrad. And a lot of the questions they ask are very like, which way is God's will? Should I do a PhD or should I not? And those are important questions. I think that your early 20s are a high stakes time. You can make a lot of big calls that really shape your life. And I don't want to undervalue that. But I also think that the things that I found most helpful and I have found most helpful in those areas of my life were not the high stakes questions. It was, what kind of person am I becoming? What kind of life am I cultivating? What are the habits in my life I'm cultivating? What are the people? You know, my mom used to always say, in the abundance of counselors, there's victory. What are the people that you're surrounding yourself with? How are they nourishing you? And so the book, I'm probably rambling, not answering this question very well, but I tried to think about those things throughout it, while also thinking about not being afraid of making big choices when the time comes, not being afraid to say yes to callings, whether those are callings of, you know, what you feel called to do in work or in life, but also even things like not being afraid of answering the call of marriage, if that's for you. And I think that that's something my generation is just kind of paralyzed by, is they're pretty jaded from being, not just from kind of having seen our own parents do various things, but also I think just having the internet, being able to see all the crazy things everyone does all the time makes you just kind of aware of how fragile the world is. And I think I wanted to, in some gentle way, kind of give people some ways to think about nurturing the garden of your life so that it is healthy and deep, but also some bravery about when the moment comes, saying yes to big things and not sitting in reticence your whole life. It's a very rambly answer, but I hope that.
No, that's a good point. I have seen that there is a kind of paralysis among younger generations. Can you describe that a little bit? What's that look like when you see it?
I think when I see it, it's usually kind of an inability to make decisions in the here and now, because you're trying to kind of work these things out to their very end. So it's not being able to do a master's because you don't know if you want to do a PhD, because you don't know if you want to go into academia.
Right.
Instead of saying, do I want to do a master's? Am I enjoying this job instead? Do I have money to do a master's? Asking those kind of, what is directly in front of me? What are the people around me saying? And instead kind of asking these abstracted out there questions. Similarly with dating, it's asking, yourself, really, just express my own opinion here. What you should be asking is, do I want to go on a date with this person? Do they seem nice? Do I have a sense that they have good relationships with people around them? And instead going, am I prepared to marry them? Are they going to have, do I want to have kids? And I think that tends to be what I see. And I don't know if that's just my generation or if it's just human beings in general, but I think a lot of what I think helps us move past paralysis is attending to this moment, this decision, what is in front of us, because we can't control what's 10 or 15 years ahead of us. And so I think that's what I see often. So when I talk to people about, when they're finishing undergrad and they're trying to decide what they're due, I say, I try not to think, how am I going to plan my next 15 years? Because the next 15 years of your life are not going to go how you expect, because that's just life. You need to think about what are the wise, reasonable, humane questions that I can answer about my life right now and the kind of life I will have if I make this decision. Not to not think about the future, because obviously you do need to think about the future. But I think there can be kind of a huge abstraction that can happen, partially because we live in a world where there's so many options that we have the impression that we can choose a path way out in the distance. Does that make sense?
Yes, I often think that so I was halfway through my 20s before we had the popular internet, like where you could have a web browser and go on and do things. And so having grown up mostly before the internet, I have wondered if, among other things, the increase in technology hasn't increased young people's sense of their options, but also vastly increased their anxiety about choosing one of them.
I think so. Yeah.
And leads to a kind of paralysis. And also, I think the other thing that has happened probably in the last 25 years or something is there has grown in our culture such an intense emphasis on succeeding in a way that was not present prior to the internet. I think prior to the internet, you didn't have a sense that you had to compete with every living human being for every possible resource.
Yes. I think that's part of what I mean by the kind of sense of like, they have this kind of glowing path before them of whether they'll become, a professor. And I think that's such a hard path. Like most of us, even the best scholars often don't end up doing that. So don't decide to do something based on this kind of idealized distant success that may not happen. And at least for me, I feel like I've had a lot of relief and satisfaction from saying it's much more important to live a humane life than it is to live, in my mind, a quote unquote successful life.
What's the difference between a humane life and a successful one?
I think part of it's just the energy, where you're putting your energy. So
what is a humane life in your mind?
In my mind, it is one in which you can try to have rich relationships with people who are reciprocal and kind, and a good community that spiritually nourishes you. It means you have some boundaries on how you're spending your time every day, that you're not, if you don't need to, because life, sometimes you go through periods where you do have to have inhumane hours, whether that's to finish a degree or to care for a family. And that's just what life is. But to the extent that you can, letting life be more than labor, being able to see some green spots every once in a while. And there are ways in which in my own life where I can pinpoint things I think I could be more successful on if I were willing to sacrifice in some ways that I'm not willing to sacrifice on, because I would rather have things that I consider to be more humane, if that makes sense.
Well, I think when you say a humane life, you mean a life in which you're actually allowed to be a human being, and in which being a human being is being a human being and everything associated with it is the priority.
Yes.
Yes,
not
it brings us in a way full circle, because when you say humane life, you mean a life in which you are not a machine.
exactly. And so what I count to be human, the metaphors I use to describe that, matter for that question of humane.
Yeah, so you mean you want to live your life based on your own metaphors.
Mm.
In your
Yes.
Yes.
Well, and I guess
What
I
about the
don't just
metaphors
mean,
that you think are worth living out?
yes. Well, and I think the metaphors which seem to accord closer with reality, right? Because I think part of the reason that machine is not a good metaphor is that humans are not, in fact, like machines.
Right.
Whereas there are ways in which we are. I had a conversation on my podcast with Malcolm Guide about this, that there's a sense that a tree is a more appropriate metaphor for a human being than a machine, because there is more about a tree that is similar to it than
Sure.
a machine.
Yes, that is why people love trees, and nobody really loves machines.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. What's next for you?
What's next for me? At the moment, I'm staring into the mouth of this giant book I'm trying to finish.
And it's a giant book. It's different from your first two?
Well, this one will be the academic one, so it will be it will probably be with some academic publisher, and it'll be about 80,000 words, and it'll have a lot of footnotes. But all that to say, I am
And also
actually
about
looking
death.
forward to it. Yes, and about death. Yes.
Right.
But I actually, having said that, I am looking forward to it.
Sure.
I feel like I've had enough distance from the PhD that I'm actually enjoying revisiting it.
Okay, great. All right. And people can find you on Twitter, and you have a website. Tell people a little bit about that if they want to follow up.
Yes, you can find me on all the social medias except for TikTok, because I'm too old for that and it doesn't seem humane.
Very good.
I'm also on Substack. So I think if you type in joyclarkson.com, it should come up. But you can also just look up Joy Clarkson. And I also have a podcast that I do intermittently. I did it quite faithfully for the launch of my book, but I will do it less faithfully now. And but I do send out kind of an email every week with interesting, amusing, and beautiful things that I've seen. So if you're looking for interesting, amusing, or beautiful things, you should sign up for my Substack.
Thank you very much, Joy.
Thank you.